The woman known to history as Coco Chanel was born on the 19th of August 1883 in the poorhouse of the town of Saumur in western France as Gabrielle Bonheur Chanel. Gabrielle's father was Albert Chanel, a street vendor who sold work clothes and other garments, often traveling between towns and villages in western France. Her mother was Eugénie Jeanne de Vol, a laundrywoman who worked in the Saumur poorhouse run by the religious order of the Sisters of Providence. Coco's baptismal namesake, Gabrielle Bonheur, was a nun at the poorhouse in Saumur, who agreed to act as her godmother. Gabrielle would only become known as Coco in her early 20s, when she would adopt the moniker as a stage name while singing in café cabarets. Her birth name was originally registered through the Saumur poorhouse as Gabrielle Bonheur Chasnel, with an S in the middle of her last name, presumably a clerical error, as her mother was too ill to be present at the registration and her father was traveling, selling clothes at the time of her birth. In later life, Coco never changed this error on her birth certificate. Historians have assumed that she did not do so because it would have required acknowledging her origins at the Saumur poorhouse. Her self-mythologizing in later years would attempt to cover up her very modest background.
This video is brought to you by War Thunder, the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever created. With War Thunder, you can play planes, helicopters, ships, and more than 2,000 tanks in dynamic combined arms PvP battles. Every vehicle is modeled in incredible detail, offering a highly immersive combat experience. War Thunder also offers in-depth customization for vehicles, with hundreds of camouflages and historical markers for your vehicles, as well as 3D decorators such as bushes and equipment, and the vehicles span over 100 years of development, from the 1920s to the present day. Our favorite is the amphibious vehicle. They can go anywhere. It's exciting how the different vehicle types, ground, air and naval, interact. But our favorite aspect of War Thunder is the amazing sound effects. Play free now on PC, Xbox Series X and S, PlayStation 5 or the previous console generation. Players new to War Thunder or who haven't played for at least 6 months can claim a large bonus pack by clicking the link in the description. This includes multiple premium vehicles, a premium account, an exclusive 3D decorator for your vehicles, and it's available for a limited time.
Gabrielle was the second child, born to Albert and Eugénie. They had already had another daughter, Julia, born the previous year in 1882. Yet the couple were not married at a time when having one, let alone two, children out of wedlock was frowned upon in Catholic France. Gabrielle's mother's family began to apply pressure on Albert Chanel to marry Eugénie, which he did in 1884. Gabrielle's childhood was an extremely difficult one. Her parents eventually ended up having 6 children. After Julia and Gabrielle, they would go on to have 3 boys and 1 more daughter. Alphonse in 1885, Antoinette in 1887, Lucien in 1889, and Augustin in 1891, though the latter died at just 6 months of age. The family lived in poverty-stricken circumstances, eventually settling in a 1-room apartment in the town of Brive-la-Gaillarde, to the east of Bordeaux and south of Limoges. It was here that Gabrielle's mother died in 1894, when Chanel was just 11 years of age. In later years, Coco claimed that Eugénie died of tuberculosis, a disease which was ravaging Western society at the time, but it seems more likely that she passed from a combination of the family's impoverished conditions and pneumonia, exacerbated by her failure to recover from one pregnancy after another in the 1880s. When she died, Albert was unable to look after the 5 surviving children and maintain his job. Thus, the Chanel boys were quickly sent out to get jobs, while Gabrielle, Julia and Antoinette were sent to a convent in Aubazine, which functioned as an orphanage. They were raised here throughout their teenage years in a tough, Spartan environment. Yet it was significant in Chanel's development in one way in particular. It was here that she first learned to sew in the mid to late 1890s. When she turned 18 years of age in 1901, Gabrielle had to leave the convent at Aubazine. She headed for the nearby town of Moulins, and it was here that she first acquired the name Coco as a stage name when she became a performer at the local cabaret pavilion. This was the era of the Moulin Rouge and the Folies Bergère in France, while the venues where Coco performed in the town of Moulins in the 1900s were doubtlessly less salubrious than those in Paris. They were indicative of the wider Belle Époque culture into which she was emerging as a young woman. By the mid-1900s, she had drifted to the larger town of Vichy in the Auvergne-Rhône region of central France, with its numerous concert and cabaret halls, often spending the summer months here when Vichy was visited by many tourists, looking to avail of the spa baths and then returning to Moulins in the off-season. It was in the latter town where she began a relationship with Étienne Balsan, a former cavalry officer and member of a leading textile design family. They began a lengthy affair. Some studies of Coco Chanel's life have implied that her nephew, André Pallas, was in fact an illegitimate child born to Coco from her affair with Balsan, but this is almost certainly incorrect. In reality, André was her nephew, having been born sometime earlier to Coco's older sister Julia and a man whom Julia had met while still living at the convent in Aubazine. Julia ultimately ended her own life when the boy's father left her for another woman, and Coco undertook raising her effectively orphaned nephew for many years, sending him to boarding school while she worked in Moulins, Vichy and other towns in the 1900s, and then in Paris in the 1910s. By the late 1900s, Chanel had set herself up in Paris, thanks in large part to financing from her new lover, Captain Arthur Edward Capel, the son of a wealthy British shipping merchant and a noted polo player in England, along with backing from Balsan, who she continued to see at the same time. With Balsan and Capel's money and resources, Chanel was able to begin her first forays into the fashion world of the French capital, using her sewing experience and skills acquired at Aubazine. In 1909, she set up a millinery shop at 160 Boulevard Malesherbes. Her apartment upstairs, which was provided to her by Balsan, became a meeting point or salon for members of the Parisian French upper middle class. All of this was important in more ways than one. While Balsan and Capel provided Chanel with the material resources necessary to start the House of Chanel company, they also introduced her to French high society in ways which allowed a woman from a very humble background in Western France to begin to learn what people with money wanted to wear and generally how they wanted to be perceived by those around them. This was as crucial to the early success of Chanel as the financial backing of her lovers. At first, Chanel's business focused primarily on making hats. It was this activity for which she first acquired a license, becoming a milliner in Paris in 1910, the year in which the Chanel company is said to have started. Her first full boutique was established at 21 Rue Cambon, a stone's throw from the Place de la Concorde, the Tuileries Gardens and the Louvre on the right bank of the Seine. Soon she began expanding the business, with a particular emphasis on sports clothes that were fashionable as well as practical, what would today be called a country club aesthetic. This consisted of blazers, lined shirts, blouses, sweaters, and jacket suits at a time when individuals still played sports like tennis while wearing full-length trousers and other clothing which restricted one's movement. By 1913, Chanel had opened 2 additional stores, one in Deauville in Normandy in northwestern France, and another in the town of Biarritz on the Bay of Biscay, where she catered as much for the British and Spanish tourist trade as her French clientele. By that time, the business was successful enough that she was effectively financially independent, though she continued to see Capel throughout the 1910s, even after his marriage to Lady Diana Wyndham in 1918. However, he was killed in a car accident the following year, an event which Chanel stated many years later that she never fully recovered from emotionally. Chanel's business was, like a great many others, negatively impacted by the outbreak of the First World War in the summer of 1914. With most of Europe's great powers at war with one another, supply routes and trade were hampered across Europe, while the German campaign against shipping in the Atlantic Ocean also limited the supply of raw materials to France from the Americas. Consequently, the French textile industry encountered difficulties, but for Chanel, whose business was based on quality rather than quantity, things remained afloat. Her store in Biarritz did particularly well. Located in southwestern France, as far away from the fighting of the Western Front in northeastern France as one could get, the location benefited from neighbouring Spain's neutrality and the influx of British moneyed tourists who could still afford to travel but found Paris or northern France to be off-limits during wartime. By 1917, Harper's Bazaar was reporting that Chanel's clothing was considered to be the most fashionable in wartime Europe. As a result of this success, Chanel was able to accumulate enough capital that when the war finally came to an end in November 1918, she was in a position in 1919 to purchase 31 Rue Cambon, a building just down the street from her original millinery shop in central Paris. Here she founded her first official boutique in the French capital shortly after the war ended. The post-war years were not ones of automatic recovery for the European economy. The years between 1918 and 1923 could be considered in many ways just as difficult as the 4 years of the First World War, as the Spanish flu swept across Europe in 1918 and 1919, killing millions as it did, while civil wars, revolutions, and wars of independence ravaged nearly half of Europe's nations, notably Russia, Germany, Turkey, and the many constituent nations of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire. In this environment, luxury brands like Chanel faced a challenging time, yet this was also an age in which the upper class's wealth was relatively impregnable. Coco consequently benefited from her clientele being able to continue to buy her products in the late 1910s and early 1920s. Indeed, she actively courted the upper-class and middle-class intellectuals and bohemians in France and beyond, realizing that who wore her clothes was nearly as important as the quality of the products themselves. It was an early indication of her awareness of the importance of effective marketing, and Chanel was in essence a prophet of 20th century branding techniques in many ways. As the 1910s gave way to the 1920s, the Chanel brand and company really began to take off. This was aided by the economic boom, which began from the early 1920s onwards, as the political situation across Europe began to stabilize. Chanel was a great beneficiary of the Roaring Twenties, both because people had disposable income to spend on designer clothing and apparel, and also because Chanel's designs were of their time for the more liberal 1920s. Chanel clothing became particularly prized by flappers, the name given to young women in the 1920s, who preferred less conservative clothing and who enjoyed jazz music, socializing, and who had a much less conservative outlook on drinking, sexual activity, and public conduct than the older generations. In tandem, Chanel's profit and business operations began to expand significantly. By 1927, for instance, she had expanded to occupy a block of buildings, running from number 23 to number 31 on the Rue Cambon in central Paris, while outlets were opened in other towns and cities as demand increased amongst the middle classes. The 1920s also saw Chanel launch two of its most iconic products. In 1921, Coco released the company's first perfume. Chanel No. 5, as she named it, was a fragrance devised by the Franco-Russian chemist Ernest Beau. It was a balance of the delicate fragrances often worn by women of high society and the more daring, muskier scents favored by courtesans, thus appealing to a range of women in the more sexually liberated 1920s. The bottle in which Chanel was sold from its earliest days has become an iconic part of its brand, with a striking square, glass bottle, although the bevel has changed over the decades. The inspiration for this seems to have come from the toiletries, which Capel used to carry with him when he and Chanel were romantically involved in the 1900s and 1910s. These were held in plainer bottles than the elaborate cut-glass perfume bottles sold to women by many fashion houses. Chanel evidently liked the simplicity of the aftershave bottles and used them for Chanel No. 5, although it has also been argued that she was effectively mimicking the design of a whiskey decanter. Finally, the name was derived from the fact that when Beau had drawn up a number of different scents to present to Chanel, the one which she liked and which became Chanel No. 5 was simply the one located in the fifth vial presented to her. From such rudimentary beginnings was Chanel No. 5 born. Chanel used a clever marketing campaign whereby she first gave bottles of the fragrance to high society friends to generate interest in it. When it finally went to market in her boutiques, sales of the much-hyped perfume were immediately high. Nearly as iconic as Chanel No. 5 was the little black dress, which Chanel began to sell in 1926. Although black dresses had been a luxury item of high society during the Renaissance and Baroque periods, black clothing had become synonymous in the 19th century with funerals and with mourning. Chanel hoped to reverse this development, arguing that black dresses should be the height of fashion. As with all Chanel products by the mid-1920s, marketing was key. When the company began selling its first little black dress, It was accompanied by a spread in Vogue magazine with a picture of the short, calf-length, straight and relatively simple piece of clothing. Alongside this, Vogue ran an editorial in which it hypothesized that Chanel's little black dress was set to become the fashion equivalent of Henry Ford's Model T car, an item of high fashion which could be produced in bulk and so sold at a reasonable price, a development which the magazine supposed would make it, quote, a sort of uniform for all women of taste. They were not entirely wrong. Sales of Chanel's little black dress were impressive, beginning to overturn the Victorian conception of black dresses being funerary and mourning attire. On the back of the success of Chanel No. 5 and the little black dress, Chanel's product range continued to expand in the 1920s and into the early 1930s, unhindered to a large extent by the Great Depression, which followed the Wall Street crash of the autumn of 1929. Her designs were eclectic. For instance, in the early 1920s, Coco began experimenting with Slavic-inspired designs. One evening dress, which Chanel began selling in 1922, came with a matching babushka headscarf. This was in part owing to her partnership with the embroidery house Kitmir, which had been established in Paris in the post-war period by Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna, a granddaughter of Tsar Alexander II, who had ruled Russia as a reformer from 1855 until his assassination in 1881. Maria had fled her homeland with the onset of the Russian Revolution in 1917, and now brought an Eastern fashion aesthetic to the French capital, which Coco incorporated into her clothing range in the 1920s. Eventually, the collaboration between Chanel and Kitmir ended in 1928, when the Grand Duchess sold the business, which had been poorly managed and hemorrhaged money despite the success of its association with Chanel. Other successes of Chanel in the 1920s included the introduction of the first women's suit range, while the first Chanel handbag, the design of which was inspired, like so many other Chanel products, by the utility and simplicity of male soldiers' bags, was launched in 1929. One final element of Chanel's life which is worth noting for its lasting impact on society was sunbathing. For centuries in early modern Europe and into the 19th century and early 20th century, pale skin had been viewed as the ideal of female beauty. Cosmetics were designed to lighten the skin, and upper-class women and aristocrats generally tended to avoid the sun and its tanning effect. Yet there was a growing amount of scientific information to suggest that a certain amount of direct sunlight was good for avoiding diseases like rickets. Thus, there was a movement towards what we would now call sunbathing in the 1900s and 1910s, but it was Chanel who really popularized the notion in the 1920s. In 1923, while on a cruise on the French Riviera, Coco was sunburned. In the days that followed, as the redness turned to tan, she was photographed stepping from a boat at the seaside resort of Cannes. The photos of a woman who by the mid-1920s had developed a reputation as a paragon of fashion and taste quickly set off a trend whereby having a tan became a positive in European society. Incredibly, this simple act has had a lasting influence, and sunbathing became a 20th century phenomenon. In the course of the 1920s, Chanel began to associate her brand with the most visible aspects of contemporary popular culture. This meant anything on stage or on screen. Hence, in 1924, she designed the costumes for the dance opera Le Train Bleu, directed by the Russian ballet composer Serge Diaghilev and choreographed by Vaslav Nijinsky. It was the first of numerous stage productions for which Chanel provided costumes and outfits. This pattern continued into the 1930s, and in 1931 Coco headed for Hollywood at the invitation of Samuel Goldwyn, the head of one of the largest studios emerging in Los Angeles at the dawn of the age of the talkies. Goldwyn, a Polish-American businessman, had met Coco while holidaying in Monte Carlo. The deal she reached with Goldwyn was enormous, with the studio head offering her $1 million, the equivalent of upwards of $100 million in today's money, to visit America twice a year to design clothes for his films. However, while she designed dresses for a number of films in the 1930s and acquired both Marlene Dietrich and Greta Garbo as clients, Chanel found American culture garish and the world of Hollywood films unsophisticated by comparison with interwar Paris. Her arrangement with Goldwyn dwindled as the 1930s progressed. Coco's personal life was tumultuous by the time she was visiting Hollywood in the 1930s. In the post-war years, she was involved in a number of high-profile affairs and relationships. For instance, in the mid-1920s, she was involved with Pierre Reverdy, a French surrealist poet whose work inspired much of the Dada movement. More controversial was her relationship with Paul Iribe between 1931 and his death in 1935. Iribe was a designer and illustrator who had worked for Cecil B. DeMille in Hollywood in the 1920s, notably drawing up the designs for the look of Egypt for DeMille's version of the Ten Commandments in 1923. Between 1933 and 1935, Coco helped finance Iribe's journal Le Témoin, The Witness, a publication which presented the artworks of Iribe and others. The 69 issues of the journal, which appeared in the mid-1930s, were highly political, with Iribe demonstrating a charged sense of antipathy towards foreigners in France, a pronounced anti-Semitism, and an ultra-nationalist platform. As we will see shortly, this appears not to have conflicted with Chanel's own politics by the 1930s. Beyond her sexual relationships, Chanel continued to mix in bohemian and artistic circles in Paris throughout the 1920s and 1930s. These were hedonistic times, and there was one rumor around Paris at the time that Coco had actually acquired her first name in reference to the prolific quantities of cocaine taken at her parties in the 1920s. While this explanation is probably somewhat spurious, we do know that Chanel developed a habit of injecting herself with morphine on a daily basis in the early 1930s. She would remain addicted to opiates for the remainder of her life. The 1930s saw Chanel branching out further again into women's jewelry. In 1932, the company held an exhibition of its first items, one which made clear that this range would certainly be on the higher end of Chanel's products. The show featured products called the Comet and the Fountain, two necklaces containing multiple diamonds. While this show presented material which was not exactly for general purchase, the 1930s were notable for the manner in which Chanel began to incorporate rhinestones and other smaller and more modest gemstones into the fashion house's dresses and products, something which disseminated into other fashion houses in the years that followed. The end result of all of this rampant growth in the 1920s and early 1930s, and the manner in which Chanel had established itself as the preeminent fashion house in not just France, but in Europe, was a company which had a huge revenue and that employed upwards of 4,000 people in various capacities as seamstresses, shop employees, and designers. Only one company could rival it by the mid-1930s. This was the house of Schiaparelli, which had been founded in Paris in 1927 by the Italian aristocrat fashion designer Elsa Schiaparelli. Beginning with knitwear and then moving into avant-garde and surrealist design, Schiaparelli soon followed Chanel's lead in associating with some of Paris and France's leading artistic figures in order to promote her products. Notably, in Schiaparelli's case, the artist and filmmaker Salvador Dali, and the poet, playwright, and visual artist Jean Cocteau. By the early 1930s, Schiaparelli's range had expanded dramatically. Although many individuals lambasted Schiaparelli's designs in the 1930s as being impractical or even bizarre, she was the only designer in France in the 1930s whose influence and reputation matched that of Chanel. Perhaps if history had not unfolded as it did in Europe in the late 1930s to mid-1940s, Coco and the House of Chanel's enormous success might have continued unmarred by controversy. But a chain of events beginning in Germany and the choices she would make in that decade would ultimately cast a shroud over Coco Chanel's legacy. Early in 1933, after a rapid ascent in political popularity, following economic turmoil partially caused by the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression, the Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler, came to power in Germany. They were determined to reverse what they perceived as the humiliation foisted upon Germany at the end of the First World War, and to make their nation the foremost power of continental Europe. This would mean a new war, with France being one of the primary targets, not just to recover the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, which had been lost following the First World War, but also to dominate Germany's western neighbor. Initially, the Nazis had anticipated needing a gradual military build-up to accomplish their aims, intending to wait until 1941 or 1942 to initiate full-scale war. but when the European powers were both sluggish to rearm and put up little resistance to Germany's annexation of Austria and Czechoslovakia in 1938 and 1939 respectively, Hitler moved the schedule forward and in September 1939 invaded Poland. This was a step too far for both Britain and France, and they declared war on Germany in response. This was the beginning of what would become the Second World War. For Coco Chanel and many other French people, the outbreak of the war in the autumn of 1939 impacted little on their lives to begin with. The fighting was largely confined to Poland, with only limited border skirmishes and forays taking place along the Franco-German border. Hence, while the news of the German occupation of Poland was concerning for many in Paris, beyond the obvious signs of military mobilization and the imposition of rationing, life went on much as it previously had in the final months of 1939 and into early 1940. However, normal life came to a shuddering halt in the late spring, as the Nazis first conducted a blistering campaign against Denmark and Norway, and then proceeded to invade the Low Countries and northeastern France. The speed of the German advance caught both the French military and the British Expeditionary Force in northern France by surprise, and within weeks the Nazis were closing in on the capital. The French government fled on the 10th of June, and the Germans occupied the city 4 days later. A collaborationist government negotiated surrender terms, whereby the southern half of France would be ruled by a semi-autonomous government based out of the town of Vichy, where Chanel had spent summers performing in the 1900s. But Paris was to be occupied by the Nazis for the next 4 years. It was a period during which countless French men and women like Coco Chanel would have to decide whether to resist the regime or collaborate with it. As we will see, Coco Chanel chose the latter. Upon the commencement of war in September 1939, Chanel had released a public statement affirming her belief that a period of renewed warfare across Europe was not a time for high fashion, and that she consequently intended to close all of her shops, except for the flagship enterprise on the Rue de Cambon. This was not necessarily an unreasonable step to take. After all, with rationing being introduced across the continent and trade networks disintegrating as nations went to war with each other, there would be a lack of raw materials available to make high-end fashion, and few people would have been comfortable investing in conspicuous signs of wealth in such straitened times. But it has also been suggested that Chanel used the outbreak of the war to exact revenge on her employees, many of whom had engaged in disputes over working conditions and pay in 1936, during a general strike amongst the French labor unions. Whatever her motives might have been, we know what fate ultimately befell Chanel's employees. Nearly 4,000 people found themselves out of work from the late autumn of 1939 onwards. The House of Chanel had effectively been furloughed until the end of the war. This has raised questions as to what Chanel was doing herself throughout the conflict, especially after the occupation of Paris in the summer of 1940. The answer, revealed by a number of sources in recent times, is not as one would hope for a historical figure of such cultural influence. Chanel would spend much of the war consorting and collaborating with the Nazi regime. Her willingness to countenance the Nazis in France was seen early on when she took up residence in the Hotel Ritz on the Place Vendôme in central Paris. Following the occupation of the French capital in June 1940, the Ritz had quickly become a favorite haunt of the leading members of the occupation Nazi government. Thus, anyone staying here or consorting with other guests was making a clear statement in favor of the German takeover of France and Nazi ideology. Moreover, this interpretation of Chanel's choice in residence is aligned with Chanel's own attested political and racial views by the early 1940s, which were foreshadowed by her relationship with Uribe and her support for his ultra-nationalist journal, The Witness, in the 1930s. As such, her decision to shut Chanel's stores and operations across France in the autumn of 1939 has been viewed by some historians as part of an effort to undermine her Jewish business partners. One particular instance of such efforts stands out: her attempt in 1941 to use anti-Semitic laws in Nazi-occupied France to steal company profits from her Jewish business partner, whose descendants, in a twist of fate, would go on to own the Chanel brand to this day. While Chanel was the face and primary owner of the House of Chanel, she had had a significant business partner since the early 1920s. This was Pierre Wertheimer, a scion of a German Jewish family who had moved from the Alsace region around the Franco-German border to Paris, following the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. They remained in the French capital after the swift Prussian victory in that war, and Pierre was born in the city in 1888. As a young man in his 20s, Pierre became involved in the cosmetics industry in France and helped develop a dry rouge for the notable French makeup company Bourjois. Such was the success of this product that Wertheimer rose quickly within Bourjois, and in 1917 he and his brother Paul had become directors thereof. It was just a few short years later that Chanel and Wertheimer began negotiations to use Wertheimer's business contacts and industry links to help market Chanel No. 5 globally. Eventually, Chanel, Wertheimer, and several other French and Jewish investors in the cosmetics and fragrance industry reached an arrangement in the mid-1920s, whereby the Wertheimers would effectively manufacture, distribute, and otherwise manage Chanel No. 5. They would receive 70% of the profits in return for effectively running Parfums Chanel. As the subsidiary became known, Coco would become an all-but-silent partner. She would have to do very little henceforth and would receive 10% of all profits based on her intellectual copyright of the fragrance and branding. While many would have been happy with this arrangement, as the Wertheimers expanded the reach of Chanel No. 5 and increased sales in the course of the 1920s and 1930s, Coco became increasingly disgruntled. In 1935, she had already attempted to sue Pierre and his family, but the suit had failed as Coco was trying to dispute the validity of a binding legal agreement, which she had freely entered into years ago. She now set out to use the occupation of France by the Nazis and the pronounced anti-Semitism of the new regime against the Wertheimers and their Jewish heritage. Beginning in 1941, she began petitioning the German occupation government in France to be given sole control of Parfums Chanel, using a Nazi law which allowed people of allegedly Aryan race to take over Jewish businesses. She was also able to claim that the Wertheimers had abandoned the business when they fled to the United States to avoid Nazi persecution in 1940. However, she was surprised to learn in the course of the summer and autumn of 1941 that Wertheimer had taken steps to prevent her seizing the company. Before he and his family fled France, he had transferred his 70% stake, and with it the controlling shares, to Félix Amiot, a businessman of Christian and French heritage with whom the Nazis would not interfere. Thus, Coco failed to secure control over Parfums Chanel from the Wertheimers during the war, but the entire incident evinced her willing to use anti-Semitic laws for personal gain. But Chanel's support for the Nazi regime and its ideology extended further. It is now clear that from 1940, she was deeply involved with the Sicherheitsdienst, or SD, an internal security service force within Nazi Germany and the occupied parts of Europe, which was headed in Western Europe by Walter Schellenberg. The SD is less notorious today than the dreaded Gestapo amongst the German security forces, but its range of operations and overall control of Nazi policing in countries like France was actually considerably greater than those of the Gestapo throughout the Second World War. Chanel had evidently come into contact with the SD and Schellenberg very soon after the Nazis occupied Paris in the midsummer of 1940. It seems beyond dispute today that she was an SD agent in Paris from that time onwards for the next 4 years. Given the nature of this activity, much of the documentary records for this clandestine work would necessarily have been destroyed, as the Nazis burnt their records in the French capital in advance of the Allied capture of the city in the late summer of 1944, but documents have been found in recent years which refer to Chanel as Agent F7124 in occupied France. This, along with ancillary information, points clearly to Chanel's collaboration with the Nazi regime. Another aspect of this entanglement with the Third Reich concerned Chanel's love life. Sometime after the German occupation of Paris in 1940, Coco began a relationship with Baron Hans Gunther von Dinklage. Von Dinklage was a German diplomatic attaché to the occupation regime in the French capital and also served as an Abwehr spy in Paris. He had close contacts with Heinrich Himmler, the head of the German SS and one of the senior-most members of the entire Nazi regime, and Joseph Goebbels, the German propaganda minister who had a major role in spying, propaganda and legal matters in France from 1940 onwards. By 1942, Chanel and von Dinklage were romantically involved with each other, and this continued throughout the German occupation of France and beyond. there is no doubting that this relationship spilled over from their personal lives into cooperation on various espionage and spying activities in Western Europe during the war. Perhaps the most explicit sign of this is that Chanel was considered for a time as a potential negotiator and liaison between the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, and elements within the Nazi regime led by Himmler, who considered that it might be best to negotiate surrender terms with the Western Allies rather than face the possibility of the Soviet Union overrunning Germany. This did not lead to constructive talks, but as we will see shortly, Churchill did intervene on Chanel's behalf in the closing stages of the war and following its conclusion in the summer of 1945. In some instances, there is even more explicit evidence of Chanel's involvement in various clandestine Nazi activities. One such case was Operation Modelhut, a planned spy operation which was to be part of a speculative initiative which the Nazi regime began considering in 1942 to take control of Spain, a country which was headed by the fascist regime of General Francisco Franco, but which had decided to remain neutral in the war. Operation Modelhut, or Model Hat, involved Chanel as an Abwehr or Nazi counterintelligence agent heading to Madrid in 1943 to attempt to convince the British ambassador in the Spanish capital, Sir Samuel Hoare, that the Nazis were considering a negotiated peace. The mission subsequently led to Chanel heading to Berlin to meet with Schellenberg along with von Dinklage concerning the scheme, one which became extremely complicated as there were suggestions that Chanel could employ her contacts in Britain, which reached all the way up to Churchill, to aid in any effort by the Nazi regime to win the war diplomatically, even as its armed forces were suffering enormous reverses on all fronts against the Allied nations. However, Operation Modelhut was a dead letter from its very inception, as a young Anglo-Italian woman with whom Chanel had originally travelled to Madrid, Vera Bat Lombardy, ultimately betrayed details of the plan when they reached Spain. In the end, Chanel's efforts to aid the Nazi regime in its decline served only in retrospect to reveal her as an agent of Nazism and Hitler's regime in occupied France. By early 1944, Chanel must have been aware that her collaboration with the Nazi regime and the German security forces during the occupation of France could become extremely problematic for her before long. While the first years of the Second World War were marked by a run of immense victories for German armies across Europe, things had run aground for the Nazis in the winter of 1941, as the German advance into Russia stalled outside Moscow and Leningrad, and the United States then entered the war on the side of Britain and the Soviet Union, following the attack on its Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor by Germany's ally, the Empire of Japan, early that December. 1942 and early 1943 were the tipping point of the war, as the Western Allies achieved victory over Germany and Italy in the North African theatre, and the Germans lost the Battle of Stalingrad to the Soviet Union in a conflict which became the crucible of the war. With a southern front established in Sicily in the summer of 1943, the Allies' thoughts turned to invading France and ending the Nazi occupation of the north of the country. The D-Day landings opened the Western Front in early June of 1944, with Paris one of the Allies' primary targets. Though fierce fighting across northern France slowed matters, the Americans, British forces, Canadians, and their allies arrived outside Paris on the 19th of August 1944. Just 6 days later, the Nazi occupation of the French capital was finally ended after 4 long years. As elsewhere across Europe in 1944 and 1945, public attention quickly turned to identifying those who had collaborated with the Nazis and how they should be punished for doing so. It was not long before Chanel's activities during the Nazi occupation of Paris were called into question. In the autumn of 1943, the Free French government, based out of France's colony of Algeria, had established the Commission d'Épuration, a judicial committee which was to oversee the prosecution of French collaborationist war criminals once France was liberated from Nazi rule. Although the number of people prosecuted by the Commission was dwarfed by the number of summary executions carried out in France in 1944 and 1945, it did prosecute tens of thousands of individuals. Amongst those questioned by the Commission was Coco Chanel, who was first detained and questioned by the Commission in September 1944, a few weeks after the liberation of Paris. However, Chanel's was not a straightforward case. She had not held any public position within the Nazi occupation government. There was furthermore no documentation to hand at the time which proved beyond a doubt Chanel's involvement with Schellenberg's SD or the Abwehr, while her relationship with von Dinklage and her known fraternization with the upper brass of the Nazi occupation government at the Hotel Ritz throughout the war certainly compromised public perceptions of Chanel. There was little evidence with which to charge her with a serious crime. Moreover, it has been widely speculated ever since that Winston Churchill, who had known Chanel for many years prior to the war, intervened on her behalf to have Coco released from the scrutiny of the Commission d'Opération. This remains a speculative claim, however, and there is no concrete evidence to confirm this. With the end of the war, a tricky business issue also quickly arose for Chanel. Pierre Wertheimer and his family had fled to the United States in the wake of the advancing Nazi regime in 1940, but while Chanel had sought to use the Wertheimers' Jewish heritage against them under Nazi law to gain control of Parfum Chanel during the German occupation of France, Pierre's decision to transfer ownership of the company to Félix Amiot before his family left Europe had foiled her plans. Now, in the aftermath of the conflict, the dispute arose yet again. Curiously, Chanel decided to hire René de Chambrun, the son-in-law of Pierre Laval, the former Prime Minister of Vichy France, who had been executed in October 1945 on account of his role in the collaborationist regime. The case was a troubling one for both parties. Chanel did not wish to have her wartime record dragged out in public, while for Wertheimer, although he had done nothing wrong, the reality was that if Coco's collaboration with the Nazis was aired extensively in public, it would quite possibly lead to a boycott of Chanel perfumes and a drastic decline in his own profit margins. Accordingly, a settlement was concluded in the early summer of 1947, without airing the company's unsavory secrets in public, whereby Wertheimer would retain the controlling interest at Parfum Chanel, but Coco herself would continue to receive 2% of the profits from any and all future sales, as well as other financial investments. It might seem as though this was a financial defeat, but in reality, the sums involved made Coco Chanel one of the wealthiest women of the 1950s and 1960s. While Chanel had managed to rescue a piecemeal victory from the jaws of defeat when it came to Parfum Chanel in the years immediately following the end of the Second World War, her own public reputation was severely damaged by her wartime conduct within France. She decided to leave as a result. Already in 1945, once the charges against her were dropped and she was released from a brief imprisonment, she headed with von Dinklage for Switzerland, a nation which had remained neutral throughout the war, and which had the dubious distinction of becoming a haven for many Nazi war criminals during the late 1940s and early 1950s. She lived in the town of Lausanne, on the northern shores of Lac Le Mans, just over 25 kilometers from the eastern border of France, where she was constantly perturbed by the rise of new fashion houses in France, Spain, and Italy, such as those of Christian Dior and Cristobal Balenciaga, whose designs Chanel deemed to be far too rigid and conservative in comparison with the House of Chanel's clothing and products in the interwar period of the 1920s and 1930s. Nevertheless, the House of Chanel's reputation was badly damaged by the war, and Coco had little opportunity to revive it through to the mid-1950s. Indeed, as late as 1949, she was called to give testimony in a French court, where she was attacked for her links to the Nazis in the trial of Baron Louis de Vaufreland, a former Nazi intelligence agent. Interestingly, on this occasion, Chanel defended her character by claiming that Duff Cooper, a former British ambassador to France following the liberation of the country in 1944, and a diplomat appointed by Winston Churchill, could provide a character reference for her wartime conduct should it be needed. Exactly what she meant and what Cooper might have revealed remains frustratingly unclear to the present day. There was something of a coda in the early 1950s to Chanel's involvement with the Nazis and the security services in occupied France during the Second World War. After the war had ended, Walter Schellenberg, the chief of foreign intelligence gathering within the SD, and an individual that Chanel had some contact with during the war, though the extent of which cannot be fully determined, was arrested in Germany. Schellenberg was a senior security agent, but he was not implicated in the high-level decision-making that had either fomented the war or led to the Holocaust of Europe's Jews and other genocidal policies, although he clearly had engaged in genocidal activity, not least his involvement in managing the activities of the Einsatzgruppen death squads, on the Eastern Front following the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. Nevertheless, he did not stand trial in the first trial of the leaders of the Nazi regime at Nuremberg, from late 1945 onwards. Instead, he stood trial during the ministry's trial of second-tier Nazi ministers in 1948. It appears that Chanel was funneling financial aid to his wife and children during this period of imprisonment. Owing to his having provided extensive evidence on the actions of the SS and the Gestapo, Schellenberg escaped with a sentence of 6 years in prison when judgment was made in 1949. In reality, however, he only served 2 years before being released on health grounds, owing to an ultimately fatal liver condition. After his release, he headed for Switzerland, where he may have been entertained by Coco for a time before ultimately settling in Turin in Italy, where he died in March 1952. When he died, it was Coco Chanel who paid for his funeral and offered further financial support to his widow. There can be few clearer statements of Chanel's sympathies and involvement with the Nazi security services during the Second World War than her continuing support for Schellenberg throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s. Chanel was not content to live in quiet retirement in Switzerland for the remainder of her life, even though by the mid-1950s she was entering her early 70s. Moreover, with the intensification of the Cold War in the 1950s and the passage of time since the Nazi era, many people who had collaborated with Hitler and the Third Reich were being reintegrated into society across Europe. Thus, in 1954, Chanel sought to re-establish her fashion house back in France. And in order to do so, she turned to a very peculiar source for financing: her longtime rival and estranged business partner, Pierre Wertheimer. It was Wertheimer who provided the necessary financing for Chanel to launch a new fashion range in 1954, one which was critically lauded across the North American and European fashion worlds, despite continuing reservations in many circles about welcoming Chanel back openly into the world of couture in light of her wartime conduct. In particular, the support of magazines such as Vogue and Life contributed to the rebirth of the House of Chanel and ensured that the company would re-emerge as one of the leading fashion companies of the 1950s and 1960s. The next years were ones of renewed success for Coco Chanel. In 1957, the company won the Fashion Oscar at the Fashion Awards in the city of Dallas in Texas. These were innovative years. For instance, the 1950s saw Chanel move into producing a wide range of jewelry items, while the house's first male fragrance, or eau de toilette, was released in the mid-1950s. 1955 also witnessed the initial release of Chanel's range of leather handbags. The 1960s were a new height for the brand, with Chanel clothing being worn by some of the most prominent women of the era, notably the actresses Jeanne Moreau, Elizabeth Taylor, and Jane Fonda. While in the political world, the wife of President John F. Kennedy, Jackie Kennedy, was a keen fan of Chanel. When her husband was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, on the 22nd of November 1963, Jackie's infamous pink suit was a Chanel design. It was most likely the former First Lady who advised her second husband, Aristotle Onassis, to employ Chanel to design the air hostess suits for his airline, Olympic Airways, in the late 1960s. Thus, the brand Chanel's popularity and cultural relevance would ultimately be restored in the decades following World War II. It should be borne in mind that Coco Chanel was intrinsically the chief designer for the company during its second iteration. She no longer controlled it to the same extent as she had in the interwar period. The agreement with Wertheimer for him to finance the relaunch in 1954 had been that the entire label would now be owned in the same manner as Parfums Chanel had been prior to the Second World War. What this meant was that Chanel owned just 10% of the company, with the Wertheimer family holding a 70% controlling stake. Moreover, Pierre acquired the other 20% in the late 1950s, ensuring his family's control over the firm in the decades to come, as Jacques Wertheimer, his son, was effectively becoming the controlling party within the business as Pierre entered semi-retirement. Chanel continued to work into old age. She never considered retirement, residing at the Hotel Ritz, where she had continued to live whenever in Paris since the days of the German occupation of the city in 1940. She was in the midst of preparing the spring catalogue for Chanel in 1971 when the end came. On the afternoon of the 9th of January, she felt ill and went to bed, dying early the next morning. Her funeral was held at the Church of Sainte-Marie-Madeleine in the 8th arrondissement, a grand French church which had been initiated by King Louis XV in the 18th century. The ceremony was attended by many of France's leading fashion, cultural and political figures, notably Salvador Dali and Yves Saint Laurent. She was buried subsequently in Lausanne in Switzerland, where she had spent many years living in exile after the war. Despite the prominence of the funeral plans, which were led by the First Lady of the country, Claude Pompidou, wife of President Georges Pompidou, there were rumblings in January 1971 and afterwards about Chanel's wartime activities and collaborations with the Nazi security services. Since her death, Chanel's life has been put under the spotlight by numerous extensive studies. While none have debated her success as a fashion designer, her politics and activities during the Second World War have become a matter of serious contention. While several biographies of Chanel tended to lionize her success and her influence over 20th century fashion, a biography by Hal Vaughan, published in 2011, first offered a major assessment of Chanel's life. This charted her wartime record, her involvement with the SD, her time as a Nazi collaborator, her efforts to prize ownership of Chanel entirely away from the Wertheimer family on account of their Jewish heritage, and her affair with Baron von Dinklage. This book and other studies since have also revealed the manner in which Chanel managed to escape punishment after the war, owing to her contacts within high society in Britain and France, and her exile in Switzerland in the late 1940s and early 1950s, as she waited for the furore over her public collaboration with the Nazis to die down. This has all been part of a wider process whereby other fashion houses like Hugo Boss have also confronted their links to Nazism in recent decades. The Chanel company continued to go from strength to strength, following Chanel's own demise. When she died, Chanel's personal estate passed to her nephew, André Pallas, and his daughters, Coco never having had children of her own. But overall ownership of the Chanel company passed to Alain Wertheimer, the grandson of Pierre, Coco's business partner since the 1920s, with whom she had clashed during the war and who had died in 1965. The company was in a period of decline when Alain took over, with sales of Chanel No. 5 down considerably and the brand having lost ground to other designers. Under the younger Wertheimer's leadership, a new marketing campaign was initiated, and Karl Lagerfeld was brought in as the new creative director of Chanel in 1982. Lagerfeld is credited with having modernized the brand while retaining much of its tradition as established by Coco herself. In the process, it became one of the world's leading designers and brands once again, with high-end items such as $11,000 dresses and $2,000 leather handbags ratcheting up the firm's profit margins by the 1990s. New products, such as the first Chanel watch, were also launched during these decades. Today, the company is still owned by the Wertheimer family, and in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic has set new records for revenue turnover in excess of $15 billion annually, with 310 boutiques worldwide employing over 20,000 employees. It's a long way from the milliner's shop on the Rue Cambon in Paris, which Coco opened back in 1910. Coco Chanel is one of the most important fashion designers in history. Significantly, she was the only fashion figure to be featured on Time magazine's list of the 100 most influential figures of the 20th century. What is doubly notable about this is that she came from such humble beginnings. She came from an incredibly poor family and was effectively orphaned as a child when her mother died and her father abandoned her and most of her siblings. Using her connections within high society in Paris, to whom she was introduced by her lovers in the late 1900s and early 1910s, she began building a fashion house which in the 1920s rose to become one of the most significant in France and then Europe. A sign of her success is that products like Chanel No. 5 are still as ubiquitous 100 years later as they were when she first released them. And yet there is another side to Coco Chanel, the woman who was clearly possessed of a pronounced anti-Semitism, who collaborated extensively with the Nazi regime in occupied France during the Second World War, and only narrowly escaped punishment after the liberation of Paris in 1944, likely owing to her connections within British high society. There is no reconciling these two different narratives of her life. She was at once a highly successful fashion designer who has left her imprint on modern history as a result, while also being clearly guilty of collaborating with the forces of Hitler's National Socialism between 1940 and 1944. Fortunately, because the Chanel company passed, following Coco's death, into the hands of the Wertheimer family, a Jewish business dynasty whom Coco had tried to undermine during the war, the company itself is arguably somewhat unstained by Chanel's own dalliances with the Nazis at the time of World War II. What do you think of Coco Chanel? Do her links to the Nazi regime compromise the brand and business today? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
Try War Thunder now on PC, PlayStation and Xbox. There is a large free bonus pack when you register using our link, including multiple premium vehicles, a premium account and an exclusive 3D decorator for your vehicles. Just click the link in the video description to collect your bonus and play War Thunder now.